I've assumed command of the Australian Army at a very challenging time. We're an army with a real operational focus. The war in Afghanistan is now the longest war ever waged by Australians. The men and women of the Australian Defence Force are in dire peril on a daily basis, engaged in a combat against a determined, ruthless and tenacious adversary. All three services are performing splendidly, but this war is demanding the greatest focus, commitment and indeed sacrifices from our army. And nor should we forget that we are continuing significant other deployments in Timor-Leste and the Solomons, as well as a range of smaller operations all over the world. My number one priority, as I said at the outset, is the support and sustainment of our troops on those operations. Yet those demands can't divert us from the continuous process of modernisation and adaptation, which is essential to keeping the Army ahead of the changes in technology and indeed the character of war itself. Our force planners refer to these twin obligations in a convenient sort of shorthand, describing the war we're currently engaged in as the war, while developing forces capable of fighting the next war. In other words, we must continue to deploy potent land forces capable of prevailing on a contemporary battlefield, as exemplified by the war in Afghanistan, while continuing to modernise the Army in conformity with the strategic guidance that is provided by the Government of Australia, most recently, of course, in the White Paper of 2009. Over the past decade, we, the Army, have also substantially enhanced our firepower, our combat mobility and our levels of protection. And this has reversed what I believe was a long-term, albeit gradual, decline in the fighting power of the Army, which took place in the period from the end of the Vietnam War until the strategic shock of East Timor in 1999. The goal that I've set myself as this Chief of Army is to lay the foundations for the service of the third decade of this century. And it's vital that we don't succumb to the sort of thinking that justified a serious reduction in the strength and capability of the Army that we experienced in the wake of our withdrawal from Vietnam. Now, I am well aware of the competing demands on government revenue that exist currently and in the time frame that I am addressing here this evening. It's on me to look at these matters as objectively as possible, to plan prudently, to be fiscally responsible, and to use sound and logical arguments to put that case forward. I've been the Chief of Army for 8 months now, and I've been very conscious of the great support that this government has provided me in terms of changes to our force structure, which I'll speak about later, and to the capability enhancement within my service that we have seen over the last decade and which we will continue to see for at least a decade more. Nonetheless, I believe that so-called peace dividends seldom, if ever, accrue. It would be a serious error, in my judgment, to conclude that in the wake of our drawdown from Afghanistan, the Army will not need to deploy again overseas. And yet, such implicit assumptions were made from 1976 to 1999, often in the face of very significant deployments to places such as Cambodia, Somalia, Namibia, Rwanda and Bougainville. This divergence between declared strategic preferences and actual practices has been described by a respected scholar, Dr. Mike Evans, as the tyranny of dissonance. History has clearly demonstrated that peace dividends invariably become peace liabilities when the military must restore its capabilities when the next threat arrives.